I didn't stop driving after I read the message. My mother is gone. The words sat on the screen, quiet and complete. They didn't ask for anything. They didn't explain. The road stretched ahead of me, narrow and pale under the snow. The cabin was already far behind, swallowed by trees and distance, but my body still carried it with me, tight, alert, unfinished. I kept driving. Snow gathered along the edges of the road, dulling the world without erasing it. Not the kind that cleans, the kind that muffles. I told myself I was going to the hospital for Silva, that I just needed to be near the place where I had last seen her awake, breathing, still here. But even as the thought settled, I knew it wasn't the whole truth. David would be there. If his mother had died, this was where it would end, where papers were signed, where voices lowered, where everything became final without ceremony. I didn't plan the rest. I didn't rehearse words or outcomes. I simply followed the road. By the time I reached the city, the hotel lights passed me without meaning. I didn't slow down, didn't turn. The hospital parking lot came into view, washed in fluorescent light, cars resting under a thin layer of snow. I saw his car. I don't know how long I stayed there after that. Long enough for the engine heat to fade. Long enough for the world to shrink to the space inside the windshield. People moved in and out of the building. A nurse stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter. A hospital worker pushed an empty gurney back through the doors. Life kept moving. Then David appeared. He walked slower than I remembered, his shoulders drawn inward, as if he were carrying something heavy without knowing where to set it down. I watched him before he saw me. Then he looked up, and our eyes met. I opened the car door and stepped out into the cold. I still didn't know whether I was there as a colleague, a witness, or something I no longer had a name for. For a moment, neither of us moved. The cold pressed in quietly, settling between us the way it always did, not sharp, not dramatic, just persistent. Snow lay in uneven patches across the parking lot, gray where cars had passed, white where nothing had touched it yet. David stopped a few steps away, close enough to speak, far enough to keep everything intact. "I'm sorry," I said. The words sounded inadequate the second they left my mouth. Not wrong, just too small. He nodded once. No reply. No gesture. That told me enough. Up close, the change in him was unmistakable. Not something that announced itself, but something that had settled deep, as if grief had hollowed him out, leaving the shape of the man intact while taking something essential with it. His eyes didn't quite focus the way they used to. "I'll be stepping back for a few days," he said. "Not from me, from everything. For my mother." I nodded. There was nothing else to say. The weight of it shifted then, not onto him, but onto me. Whatever happened next would happen without him watching it closely. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. Then he said, almost casually, "They've been asking questions. Not who, not what, just that." I waited. He glanced toward the hospital doors, then back at me. "There's pressure," he added, "to move things forward." That was the first crack. Not suspicion, awareness. I understood what had reached him before I did. Fragments, tone shifts, the way certain names start to linger longer in conversations than they should. I chose not to fill the silence with reassurance. Instead, I gave him something clean. "You have a suspect," I said, "not a killer." The sentence did exactly what it needed to do. Nothing more. He didn't ask how I knew, didn't challenge the line I'd drawn. I saw the moment he recognized what I was not saying, and the moment he decided he couldn't carry that on top of everything else. "I trust my team," he said quietly. It wasn't a declaration, it was a limit. I wanted to reach for him then, not to fix anything, just to acknowledge the weight of what he was holding. But grief has rules, and this wasn't my moment to break them. We stood there as snow began to fall again, soft and uncommitted, touching nothing long enough to leave a mark. The hospital doors slid open behind him. Someone called a name. Life continued, blunt and indifferent. "I should go," he said. I nodded. He turned first. I watched him walk away, his steps steady only because they had to be. And when he disappeared inside, I stayed where I was. Not waiting, just standing with what I had chosen to carry. The cold no longer felt external. The cemetery was quiet in the way winter insists on. Snow lay undisturbed between the rows, smoothing the ground into something almost gentle. Footprints appeared and disappeared as people arrived, careful not to linger longer than necessary. Everyone wore dark coats, black, gray, muted blue. I stood a little apart, close enough to belong, far enough not to intrude. The cold found its way through everything, through wool and leather, through layers meant to protect. I barely noticed. Funerals have a rhythm of their own, words spoken softly, pauses held too long, the weight of standing still while something final settles into place. As I listened, my thoughts drifted, not away, but inward. I thought of Silva, of hospital rooms and machines that never stopped humming, of the strange intimacy of sitting beside someone you know you were losing. I thought of how many times I had imagined my own ending, how close I had come to believing that it would arrive early, violent, unforgiving. I mourned her, yes, but I also mourned versions of myself I had already buried. The woman who stayed quiet, the woman who planned an escape that would have changed everything, the woman who stood on the edge of something she might not have survived. Snow began to fall again, light and uncommitted. A bird landed on a bare branch nearby, its presence brief and precise before lifting away. Life, insisting. At some point, David turned, not dramatically, just enough to see who had come. Our eyes met. I didn't smile. He didn't either. But he didn't look past me. He didn't turn away. I knew then that my presence wasn't a mistake. I was aware of myself in a way I usually wasn't, of the way my hair stood out against the dark coats around me, a quiet contrast I hadn't chosen but couldn't undo. I didn't move. The service ended the way these things always do, without resolution. People shifted, hands were shaken, condolences exchanged carefully as if they might break. I stayed until it was done, until the space around him began to close again. When I finally turned away, the snow had started to settle for good, covering what needed covering, holding everything in place. Some absences do not ask to be filled. I drove away slowly. The road out of the cemetery was narrow, bordered by snow that had begun to harden at the edges. Tires pressed it flat, leaving temporary lines that disappeared almost as soon as they were made. Nothing lasted. Winter had a way of doing that, of pressing down without announcing itself, of staying long enough to make you forget what warmth felt like. I thought of Robert, not the man people remembered, the one spoken about carefully in fragments, the one I had known. I had lived with his anger long enough to recognize its patterns, the quiet before it arrived, the way rooms seemed to shrink around him, the way words were chosen not for honesty, but for survival. I knew what he had done to me, and I knew what he had done to Hilda. It wasn't something I needed confirmed. Some truths don't require witnesses. I understood the fear, the particular kind that doesn't scream or run, the kind that settles in and waits, the kind that starts imagining futures you would do anything to prevent, including things you never thought you were capable of. I had stood on that edge myself. I had planned it, measured it, prepared for the moment after. And then I had stopped. Not because I forgave him, not because I believed he would change, but because I couldn't become what the situation demanded of me. Hilda might not have stopped, or she might have. I still didn't know. What I did know was this: people had once believed I was capable of killing him. They had looked at me and seen a story that almost fit. And now they were looking at her the same way. A suspect. A shape that could hold the blame. There was no proof yet, no certainty, only assumptions moving faster than truth ever does. I wasn't protecting a crime. I was acknowledging a reality that existed long before that night. That violence doesn't begin with a single act. That it builds. That it teaches its victims how far they might have to go to make it stop. The snow thickened as I drove, the sky lowering until everything felt pressed into a smaller space. Winter again. I wondered how many people mistake endurance for safety. How often surviving is confused with being free. I didn't excuse what might have happened, but I understood the fear well enough to know why judgment could wait. Some lines are crossed in moments. Others are worn away slowly until you don't realize they're gone. By the time you notice, the ground beneath you has already shifted. Understanding is not forgiveness. By the time I returned to the hotel, night had fully settled. Snow gathered along the curb, thickening in the corners no one cleared anymore. Inside, the lobby was warm and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a day has already taken too much. I went upstairs without stopping. In my room, I left the lights off. I took off my coat and let it slip from my hands, then stood still for a moment, listening to nothing. The thought had been with me all day. Another funeral would have to be planned. Not suddenly, not dramatically. I had known it from the moment I learned Robert was dead. And I had known, just as clearly, that it wasn't my place. I picked up my phone and called Veronica. I'd been carrying the decision with me since the cemetery, waiting until it no longer felt like avoidance. The line rang several times before she answered. When she did, her voice was tired. "I'm not very good," she said. "I've been on the phone all day." I could hear it, the strain of repeating the same questions, the same explanations, the same careful words. She spoke about logistics, about people calling, about the strange urgency that appears around death, even when grief hasn't had time to settle. I listened more than I spoke. At some point, she mentioned the investigation, not as a complaint, not as a demand, just as something she kept checking on, unable to let go of it entirely. She said she had called Novak again, that she knew he couldn't tell her much, that she asked anyway. She mentioned Hilda, quietly, as a name that now carried too much weight. She told me there were details that didn't fit the way they had before, that certain timelines no longer aligned as neatly as everyone wanted them to. She didn't speculate. She didn't accuse. She simply said it was becoming harder to ignore. When I spoke, it was only to say what I had already decided. that she should handle the arrangements, that it was right. Not as distance, as respect. She didn't hesitate. Then she said she was sorry. Not for her son, but for me. For the years she now understood better than she had before. Not because she hadn't seen anything, but because concern, back then, had been the only language she had. I let that be enough. Before we ended the call, she told me to reach out if I ever needed anything. She didn't frame it as duty, just as presence. When the line went quiet, I stood by the window and watched the snow fall steadily into the dark. Some things were already moving forward. Others I had finally set down. Not everything ends with certainty. Some things end when you stop carrying them. And I let this one go.